Busy afternoon here on this Thursday. It is just past 3:30 Eastern Time, just past 2:30 Central Time. Of course, we're following out of Michigan, the trial that continues or just began there, revolving around the mother of Ethan Crumbley, the Oxford High School shooter. This is a live picture of the trial that's taking place. And of course, viewer discretion is advised because some of these images are striking. I believe this is potentially some image of the mother at a gun range with her son as well. For more on a little bit insight into the trial, what's taking place today, we want to be joined right now by an attorney out of Michigan, Jamie London, here on Live Now from Fox. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, it is just the beginning, the opening statements and testimony taking place. Maybe what's one thing, if you're paying attention, listening into the trial, that you've heard from this case, and maybe what's one thing that you're looking into closely here for this trial?
Well, a couple of things. I guess, I think the most unique thing about this case, and I think what is intriguing a lot of people, is we're not actually prosecuting the shooter. At this point in time, we're prosecuting the parents and making an allegation that their negligence, gross negligence, led to the level of an involuntary manslaughter. We've seen this sort of decision before by prosecutors when people leave guns unattended and a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or what have you gets a hold of it. But this is the first time we've seen this in the context of a mass shooting. So that is definitely the number one fact that I think stands out, which has brought so much attention to this case.
Yeah, and then as we continue on, I do want to put up just this image because uh, we may not see it again here, but potentially an image inside the courtroom right now of what's going on. They're talking potentially about an incident at a gun range there with the mother. And of course, like you mentioned, a lot of different facets to this 4 charges of involuntary manslaughter. There are different moments in this that prosecutors are potentially trying to tie that she could have tried to stop it as well. This one potentially could be a moment that maybe rings true to that as well. What kind of moments and what moments in particular are you maybe focusing on in this kind of relationship between mother and son?
So, mother, father, and son, I
Correct.
think that the piece that really pushes the prosecution over the top by way of having a victory here is that, we have a young man who's been disturbed. There was knowledge that he was disturbed. And the father, in fact, acted as a straw buyer for this young man when he went into a gun shop and purchased a 9mm for a 15-year-old. And even if you argue that it wasn't for the 15-year-old, the 15-year-old was certainly provided access. That in of itself is a crime. And it certainly rises to the level of, you know, involuntary manslaughter, in my opinion. As far as the gun range, it goes on to, it really just goes on to purport that, we have parents that, while, we all have children that make mistakes and that's unfortunate. There comes a point in time when your parental decisions go from being a negligent parent to a grossly negligent parent, especially when it involves the death of 4 young people.
Yeah, and when you speak of that, obviously maybe culpability, negligence, and gross negligence, how fine of a line is that? Because there are moments, like you mentioned, mental health potentially being an issue, but also writings and different things that they could see at home. What is the line between negligence and gross negligence?
That's a great question. So, negligence is the sort of behavior that often a lot of us exhibit on a daily basis, but it doesn't rise to the level of criminal behavior. Grossly negligent behavior is the kind of behavior that a reasonable person can presume that those decisions, or in this case, lack of decisions, could lead to somebody being harmed. And I think that's an important distinction because nobody is suggesting that he aided and abetted their son in harming these people. This really boils down to, were you so negligent as a parent that's what it led to? And generally speaking, it's important to note that we do not have a duty
Mhm.
to protect third parties. It's unfortunate, but that is the law. Generally speaking, there are exceptions to that law, and one important exception is your children. We have a duty of care to our children, and that extends to feeding them, housing them, clothing them, and certainly protecting them from environments where they could harm others. So I think when you combine all of that, we get to the level of gross negligence, and the gun range and the buying of the weapon really is only a sliver of the evidence that the prosecutor, at least, has said they intend to present in this case.
Correct. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Of course, we also want to reiterate that viewer discretion is advised because some of these moments, some of these images may be difficult for people to kind of look back on. There is those 4 counts is Ethan Crumbley there pleaded guilty to those murder, life in prison without parole. I do want to come back to it because obviously the parents are on trial in this one. But Ethan said after his trial that they did not know and he did not tell them of his plan. And there's also been alluded to that if he takes the stand or if they call him to the stand, he'll plead the fifth. How much are his words they're going to be used in this trial?
Mm. So, to your latter question, he's not entitled to take the fifth anymore. For the most part, I know that he has an appeal pending, but at this point, he's been found guilty.
Okay.
So, his statements are and somewhat irrelevant as far as going forward. I'm going backwards. His statements really are not relevant to the decision for the jury in this case because there's no allegation that they knew he was going to commit this act or they helped him plan this act or participated in any way with knowledge. So, we often see husbands, wives, family members come out, especially after they've been convicted and sentenced to life, and say, my family member had nothing to do with this. But in this case, it really doesn't matter. That's not the allegation. The allegation is not that they knowingly did something. It's that a reasonable person in their set of circumstances would have taken some action to prevent this act from happening, and most importantly, not given him access to a weapon.
Yeah, that could be a very important facet to this as well. Jamie London, we're going to continue on with this conversation because sometimes in court today, and we want to maybe shift gears a little bit because there was testimony already taking place today, and I want to get some perspective from inside the courtroom because we did see some emotions come out. Obviously, people on the stand crying, kind of witnessing, reliving some of these moments. Very difficult, but also there were some tense moments about potentially the prosecution there showing emotion as well. In terms of that, just give me a little bit of inside the courtroom knowledge and maybe what transpired with this about how the prosecution isn't necessarily allowed to show emotion, how that could affect this trial.
Yeah, so I think it was the defense counsel
Okay.
who actually showed the emotion. And either way, that's always problematic in front of a jury, whether it's the prosecution or the defense. But as this played out, Attorney Smith, who I've known for a long time, did appear to cry in front of the jury. You never like to see any sort of exhibition by counsel that could persuade a jury, whether that's from a judge, whether that's from a defendant, a prosecution witness, or in this case, counsel. I could tell you, I know Shannon. I think it was genuine. This is an extraordinarily emotional case. But we always want to be careful to not do things that could sway the jury one way or the other. And quite frankly, I don't know that her her expression of emotion had an effect on either party in a negative way. I mean, I think you could look at it from both points of view in the sense that what she was hearing was extremely emotional, and as a mother, which I know she is, that was very difficult for her. But I think a reasonable juror could also say this isn't about what happened. One thing that I see happening in the prosecution here is that there's an extraordinary amount of evidence being put on about what occurred. They're certainly entitled to do that to some degree, but that's not the question. Everybody agrees that
Correct.
Mr. Crumbly committed this act. The question really is whether or not the parents should be held responsible for that act occurring. So I don't know how relevant that emotion is, but this is a big case. I know Shannon Smith, and I don't believe there was anything nefarious there, and the judge addressed it, and I think that the trial will move on without exception.
Yeah, it's just potentially one point there of contention and going to be a very uh, trial that we'll keep an eye on as well, but you can imagine why the emotions were there. There's certainly a community that is gripped by this since it occurred back in 2021. Jamie London, anything else that you want to add before I let you go? This has been a very insightful conversation into this trial, into the mother of Ethan Crumbley. And I just thought of one question potentially that we will end on, because obviously this revolves around Jennifer Crumbley. How much does this relate to her husband and that kind of dynamic in there? Can you kind of relate this and maybe the difference and overlay there in that contrast between mother and father?
Yeah, that's a great question because what's happened in this case, as of recently, as Ms. Crumbly's attorneys have requested the court separate the trials.
Yeah.
It's a general rule that co-defendants operating in the same level of behavior, whether it's selling drugs or in this case, being culpable for involuntary manslaughter, that they're tried together, right? It's not only for the sake of the court's convenience and not having to recall witnesses over and over, but there becomes a point in time is why should they deserve a different trial? What's unique here is that it happened late in the game, so to speak, and when that happens, the legal presumption is that there's antagonistic defenses. In other words, they're no longer on the same team.
Interesting.
Without getting deep in the legal weeds, you always have a right to face your accuser. So when we see an attorney come out late in the game and say, we want separate trials, that does suggest that there's some apprehension between the parties.
Yeah, that will be a very interesting dynamic as well. Jamie, thank you so much. This has been very insightful. The trial just beginning, opening statement, testimony. We'll keep an eye on this out of the Detroit, Michigan area. Thanks again for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
All right, thanks.